Focus on Headline. All right, let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio, we have our usual Wednesday segment reporter, Handan and Ijiang joins us. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening.
We're going to start things off with some economy-related news here. Definitely, when we talk about economy, we haven't really been getting a whole lot of rosy reports on the front. Tan, South Korea's exports declining for the fourth consecutive month, this leading to the country's largest monthly trade deficit on record. You're going to start us off with the latest figures that came in.
Right. South Korea's exports logged a steep decline in January on weak global demand for semiconductors and reduced exports to China. This led the largest ever monthly trade deficit and the 11th straight month of trade deficit, which marked the first time in 25 years. According to the Trade Ministry, outbound shipments fell over 16% on year to stand at $46.2 billion last month, which followed an on-year drop of over 9% the previous month. Exports began to fall in October last year due to slumping demand and has been sliding for 4 straight months. It marks the first time Korea's exports fell for 4 consecutive months since Korea was hit hard by COVID-19 in 2020. The Trade Ministry attributed the fall to a global economic slowdown amid high inflation and aggressive monetary tightening by major economies. The sluggish demand of the global chip market and falling prices were also the main culprits, with overseas sales of semiconductors dropping over 44% on year to $6 billion last month. Sales of petrochemicals also sank 25% to around $3.8 billion, while outbound shipments of steel products dropped to $2.7 billion. Shipments of auto parts fell over 16%, and those of bio and health items also tumbled by more than 33%. Shrinking exports to China was also one of the factors that significantly dragged down Korea's export volume, with China-bound exports sinking by over 30% to around $9 billion last month. Chip exports to China in particular fell more than 45%. Exports to China have been on the decline for 8 months in a row. Exports to the U.S. fell slightly over 6%, and shipments to the ASEAN nations also slid nearly 20%. Exports to the European Union and the Middle East inched up, however, by 0.2% and 4% respectively. Imports also fell 2.6% on year to reach nearly $59 billion in January, resulting in a trade deficit of an all-time monthly high of more than $12 billion, far higher than the previous record of $9.4 billion set in August last year. South Korea is one of the world's biggest energy importers, and the country's energy imports came to nearly $16 billion last month, accounting for around 27% of total imports. Industry Minister Lee Chang-yang said that the government takes the current situation seriously and will make all-out efforts to revive export momentum despite continued downside risks.
This is quite concerning right now, especially because, number one, you're talking about semiconductors, petrochemicals, steel products, and these are all some of the flagship items that South Korea exports quite a bit. And we're not just talking about, 5 or 6% drop. We're talking 44% drop in sales of semiconductors, 25 again for petrochemical, and then steel products dropping significantly as well. But what is concerning here, and this is kind of, I think, raises the question. I know the U.S. has been pushing for many of its allies, also in countries like in the European countries, Japan as well, to start imposing these export restrictions for semiconductor goods to China. But when you're seeing that a large chunk of these exports of semiconductors were going to China, China, and because there is a significant dip in that, we're seeing this major deficit, you start wondering whether or not South Korea would be kind of keen on jumping on board with some of the countries, like I believe the Netherlands already jumped on board with the United States with these restrictions for exports of the semiconductors here. We're going to talk more numbers this time as we are experiencing a global economic downturn. Global demand for semiconductors, again, as we talked about, has been falling. And when we talk about semiconductors, there's going to be one major company that we're going to talk about here. Samsung Electronics reported an earnings shock in its semiconductor division in Q4. Jiyoung, let's get the figures on this.
Sure. Now, operating profit in the fourth quarter of the semiconductor division, it plunged 97% on year to only 200 billion won, which fell far short of the stock market's expectations. Now, even though the company didn't disclose specific operating profit figures by each division business segment, considering the businesses the business generated the highest quarterly sales ever, analysts still estimate that its semiconductor business would have probably been close to a deficit. On Tuesday, Samsung Electronics announced that the total sales of 70.46 trillion won and operating profits of 4.31 trillion won in the fourth quarter of 2022. The company exceeded total sales of 300 trillion won last year, with sales of 302.23 trillion won and operating profits of 43.38 trillion won. However, the South Korean chip maker saw a year-on-year decrease in operating profit by 16% due to sluggish demands for its major products due to the slow economic slowdown internationally. Now, the semiconductor division barely avoided a deficit in the fourth quarter by delivering sales of 20.07 trillion won and operating profits of 270 billion won, which is the lowest operating profit since 2009 on its first quarter. Now, the company's semiconductor performance came out poorer than the market's expectations, and analysts say that this is because of a sharp and sudden downturn in demand, which came worse than what the market had expected. But Samsung Electronics indicated that they have no plan to scale back production or stop the production line. And the global semiconductor industry experts say that if Samsung curbs production, it would put a stop to falling memory chip prices. But by not curbing production, Samsung might be able to increase the market share and widen the gap with the industry newcomers during a time of sluggish demands for semiconductors.
Let's now go from talking about Samsung Electronics. We also have the other major company in charge of a lot of these semiconductor chips amid the slumping global demand for PCs and smartphones. Now we're talking about SK Hynix. This is the world's second largest memory chip producer, reporting an earnings shock for the fourth quarter of last year as well. Tom, let's get the details of this.
Right. SK Hynix announced today it swung to a deficit in the final months of last year due to the weak demand and oversupply of memory chips that led to overall global chip market slowdown. The company logged an operating loss of 1.7 trillion won in the fourth quarter, in staggering contrast to a profit of more than 4.2 trillion won it posted a year ago. It marked the chip maker's first quarterly operating loss since 2012, so the first time in about a decade. Its net loss came to over 3.5 trillion won, swinging from a profit of 3.3 trillion won a year earlier. Sales fell almost 38% to roughly 7.7 trillion won. SK Hynix makes most of its profits from selling memory chips, but the ongoing war in Ukraine, soaring inflation, and rising interest rates led consumers to cut their spending on digital devices like PCs and smartphones that need such semiconductors. And also the near end to the COVID-19 pandemic is also being cited as one of the reasons behind the sluggish chip demand. The company said market conditions have significantly deteriorated as PCs and smartphone manufacturers, major buyers of DRAM and NAND flash, moved to deplete their inventories and cut back on spending. The bigger problem, though, is that the company's performance has not yet hit rock bottom. Markets project chip business downturn will continue until the first half of the year, and SK Hynix is expected to post a continual deficit of hundreds of billions of won. According to a recent survey by Yonhap Infomax on a dozen securities firms, the sales forecast of SK Hynix for this year dropped to 28 trillion won, with an operating loss of more than 6 trillion won. SK Hynix said it plans to reduce its investment by more than half this year from last year's 19 trillion won. But the chip giant remained cautiously optimistic that things will start to improve towards the latter half of the year.
Yeah, we have to put into a lot of things into, the consideration right now because yes, it might be because of the rising inflation, the high interest rates and so forth. But if you remember at the start of the pandemic when things were, just spiraling out of control with the COVID-19 cases and a lot of people were either working from home or staying indoors, there was a massive demand for PCs, right? And games. And at the time, there was like a shortage of semiconductors because people are and graphic cards. I remember graphic cards were just like ridiculous prices because they were all upgrading their PCs. They were all buying the latest smartphones because they were spending most of their time indoors. And then I don't know how things are with other people, but you don't buy a computer or some people buy like smartphones like every year, I think. You don't buy a PC a yearly basis, right? You buy one maybe every, I don't know, 5 to 6 years. Sometimes some people use it for like 10 years and things like that. Although you need some upgrades here and there. So I feel like people just bought a whole bunch of them during the start of the pandemic. Now that everyone's kind of going out and about and going back to offices and, going to work and things like that, they don't need new PCs. There is no demand for this. And so you're obviously going to see a huge turnaround. But I do remember, again, during the pandemic, there was a lack. They were making record profit off of all the PCs that they were selling and things like that. But obviously, when we see all the changes we're seeing since about 3 years ago, it's inevitable we're seeing this. But it is shocking to see Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix both reporting these record high losses. But the biggest concerns out of all this is it shows that South Korea's semiconductor industry, again, is facing this unprecedented crisis due to the combined earnings shocks of the two major companies. So let's talk more about this, Chiyoung.
Sure, SJ. Now, as Town mentioned, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and soaring inflation and rising interest rates, this has led consumers to tighten their spending on electronics that need these semiconductors. Now, unless the memory semiconductor industry improves dramatically, Korean semiconductor companies will have no choice but to keep seeing losses for the first time, being which they can't afford to do this at this point. You just can't keep your losses and just wait until this will get better. But a lot of experts say that the recovery in demand is actually more important than cutting back on investments and production costs. But when it comes to when they predict recovery in demand, this kind of differs by each expert. So one school of thought says that they say that the demand will cover in the second half of this year as there will be some more production on servers and mobile devices. But others say that we can't just leave this to the recovery in demand and we'll have to look for some more creative ways to endure this challenge in the long run.
That's right. We got a message in from Teto who says graphic cards prices here are soaring high in the last 2 years. Now it's become more stable, including all the PC parts. Exactly. I bought a new gaming computer, I believe, when everyone was buying it. And it was, considering the kind of computer that I bought, I think was overpriced at the time. I probably buy it much cheaper now at this time, but there was a shortage of all this, and at the time, SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics, again, I remember they were recording some record profits during the height of the pandemic, which is interesting now that, things are kind of going back to normal, that they're recording record deficits right now. Nevertheless, it's not going to be the last time that we're going to be talking about this semiconductor crisis. I'm sure there's going to be more developments on this front, and we'll continue to talk about it maybe with an expert in the near future. Let's move on here. Another topic of discussion that continues to make way here on our show is the heating bills. Right now, the government has rolled out additional support plans to help the most vulnerable get through this winter amid the spiraling heating bills. Donna, what's the latest on this?
Well, the Energy Ministry announced an additional plan today to help those in need spend a warmer winter despite soaring heating costs. The plan will provide around 590,000 won to the most vulnerable, as well as those in the near vulnerable group for this winter season. Now, the near vulnerable group refers to households in the bottom 50% of the median income, meaning those who are in a slightly better financial situation than those classified as the most vulnerable, receiving basic living subsidies. The median income based on 4-member households was 2.7 million won last year. Nearly 1.7 million underprivileged households and some 400,000 lower income families are expected to receive the heating bill subsidy of 592,000 won for the winter months of December to March. The announcement follows President Yoon's approval of 100 billion won in reserve government funds for emergency use on Monday, aiming to double the amount of the energy voucher for those in need. Now, this added to an existing 80 billion won budget earmarked for those in need, raising the total amount of support funds for energy vouchers to 180 billion won. A day later, the ruling People Power Party said they're considering providing heating bill subsidies not only to vulnerable people, but also to middle-class households. The government and the ruling party are expected to convene a meeting soon to discuss ways to help lower the energy cost burden on the middle class as well. According to Statistics Korea, local monthly gas rates skyrocketed 34% in December from a year ago due to a rise in gas prices. And according to the Korea District Heating Corporation, the heat usage cost per 1 megajoule, which stood at around 65 won in March last year, rose to 75 won in April and to nearly 90 won in October, leading to over a more than 40% jump in a single year. Gas fees began to climb last year as state-owned Korea Gas Corporation has been suffering huge deficits in the aftermath of the import price hikes amid prolonged war in Ukraine, as well as several other economic factors.
I was hoping for another, because they're updating who will be eligible for these gas vouchers. And I believe in yesterday's Focus on headline, what was mentioned was there was some blind spots that they didn't look into, and that's the small business owners. And so a lot of these small business owners are, they're forced to use a lot of these gases for heating up their restaurants and their bathrooms with the water and things like that. They're saying even if there is one customer, they have to turn on the heat because the water has to, they use the bathroom and things like that. It has to be heated. So they're struggling with the heating bills. And unfortunately, at this time, I believe they are not part of the group of people who could receive these subsidies, and hopefully the government will soon see the blind spots and to also assist them as well. To cut back on expenses, public institutions will hire about 22,000 full-time employees. Now, this is the lowest in 6 years this year. Jiyoung, can you give us the details on this?
Sure. Now, according to the Ministry of Finance, this year's number would mark a decrease from the 25,542 people that were hired in 2022. And it can also be the lowest figure since 2017, which was 22,659. Now, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Strategy and Finance, Chu Kyung-ho, said while he was attending in a job fair in Seoul on Wednesday that 22,000 will actually be the minimum. So they'll try to have plus alpha more, and that the government will make efforts to create quality jobs as their main goal, despite many of the difficulties that we're experiencing in the job market. And the ministry said that the decrease came as the state-run firms offered full-time positions to irregular workers. Now, regarding to the scale of recruitment for this year, the finance minister emphasized that the government is maintaining the number of new recruits from the previous year by maximizing the capacity for new recruitment while looking into the efficiency of overgrown public institutions. This means that in order for the government to maintain the level of new recruits from the year before, they have to lay off or trim off the people who they believe play insufficient roles in the organizations. Now, previously, the government announced a plan to reduce 12,442 people, or 2.8% of the staff in public institutions. So these jobs are going to go to the new recruits. Now, going back to hiring the 22,000 full-time employees, among them, Deputy Prime Minister Chu said that high school graduates would account for 8% of this total, which is 0.5% higher than the previous year. Chu also said that they will increase the number of disabled people this year and also in the future.
I think this also kind of would affect us here on Arirang as well, because we are considered a public institution. And I know that on a yearly basis, for example, there are calls to hire news reporters. There's openings for producers and cameramen and things like that. And I know last year, for instance, they had like 2 different hiring times for reporters and things like that. And so right now, I think the consensus is that maybe this time, this year around, there might be not as many hirings for new reporters, but this is all part of what all the public institutions will need to go through here. Nevertheless, let's move on here, talk about diplomacy. South Korea, U.S., and Japan. This is kind of rare here, jointly urging North Korea to dismantle its nuclear program. This during a UN disarmament talks, to which North Korea responded, "We're not going to be giving up the nuclear weapons first." Not surprising there. There's going to be no negotiations for that purpose. Tan, let's get more on this.
Sure. Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo have jointly urged North Korea to abandon its nuclear program and stop its missile provocations at the UN Conference on Disarmament. FYI, it's a forum for the negotiation of international disarmament and arms control agreements participated by 65 UN member nations. Ambassador Yoon Sung-mi, South Korea's chief delegate to the conference, during Tuesday's session made those remarks, saying that she's exercising the right to speak on behalf of the governments of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan. She criticized the North's illicit nuclear and ballistic missile programs as a clear and blatant violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and a serious threat to peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, as well as the nearby regions. Yoon also cited the North's unprecedented provocations, including the firing of 8 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and urged Pyongyang to stop its defiance against the global non-proliferation regime, while calling for the complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of the North's weapons programs. She reaffirmed that the path for dialogue remains open for the North. Well, telling North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons is nothing new, but multiple member nations making a joint call targeting one specific country is considered quite rare during the disarmament talks. The rare move came after North Korea stressed during the Arms Control Conference last week that as long as the U.S. and its allies continue a pressure campaign, it will continue to expand its nuclear arsenal, calling it a deterrent and a means to defend national sovereignty and security. And North Korea was quick to strike back at Seoul, Washington, Tokyo's joint action. North Korean diplomat Chu Yong-chol flatly rejected the call and said the regime will never give up its nuclear weapons first, and that there can be no negotiations on that matter. He went on to say that the North's nuclear force is for the protection of its territory and people, as well as peace and security in the world.
It's kind of the argument that North Korea has been using for the longest time, and in almost sense, it almost makes sense. It's basically like, hey, I mean, everyone else has nuclear weapons. Why are you always like singling us out? And we're kind of using this as a deterrence more than anything. And so we do understand that, but of course they have shown on many occasions that they could be used for offensive reasons here. But we're going to go back again to the UN holding this disarmament conference. Again, when you talk about disarmament, one of the hot topics is going to be always North Korea's nuclear policy law, which was enacted last year. Chiang, let's discuss more on this matter here. What was discussed at the conference regarding North Korea? Let's get into a deep detail.
Sure. Now, members of the United Nations all had a thing to say when it came to North Korea's new nuclear policy law, criticizing that it's just a way of North Korea expressing its intention to develop nuclear weapons explicitly by creating a legal basis rather than discreetly developing them. To tell you what the nuclear policy law is about, North Korea passed a new law in September that updated its nuclear doctrine and provided a greater clarity about command and control of the country's nuclear weapons, which means that the new law has made it more clear about when and how North Korea would threaten and use nuclear weapons. Now, so far, no country in the world has come to recognize North Korea as a legitimate nuclear state, not even their allies, China or Russia. A Russian diplomat named Sergei Larokov said on the 28th in an interview saying that Russia only acknowledges the 5 countries that are allowed and acknowledged as the countries to have nuclear weapons under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. That means that they do not acknowledge North Korea.
Right.
Also, the European Union ambassador said that North Korea should not ever be able to legitimize their nuclear weapons. And also Mexico chimed in and says that this is actually illegal for North Korea to have nuclear weapons, and they are actually in fact threatening the international security.
Yeah, and I was watching, I did get a chance to read some of these comments that were coming out here, but the one that I was focusing most on was the North Korean ambassador Chu Yong-chol and some of the comments. And North Korea is known for very interesting wording in their comments when they're making these interesting
Very
rhetorics.
creative too.
I remember one of the things that I read was Chu Yong-chol called Japan their military. They called them a military dinosaur, is what they said. And by law, they're not supposed to have a regular army, and yet they're trying to form this army. And they also accused the United States of what they said was trying to form an Asian version of NATO, is what they said. And so you're going to see a lot of these back and forths here. And this is the frustrating thing, is that no matter how much discussions are put in place in regards to trying to disarm or denuclearize North Korea or the Korean Peninsula, it's just not going to happen right now. And we've talked about how what North Korea learned from the war in Ukraine and what Russia, the reason why people can't really directly attack Russia is because they have nuclear weapons. And so this deterrence policy. So the consensus now is North Korea is just never going to give up their nuclear weapons here. There was someone who said something about, there was some comments that I wanted to read, but nevertheless, maybe we'll get that later on. In the meantime, more diplomacy news. Foreign Minister Park Jin departing for the U.S. today for talks with the United States, his U.S. counterpart, Anthony Blinken, as well as other top officials. Tan, what is expected from his trip there?
Well, talks will mainly center on strengthening the South Korea-U.S. alliance and deepening cooperation in dealing with North Korea's provocations. During the four-day trip, Park will first meet with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York to discuss cooperation between South Korea and the UN, the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and global issues. The minister also plans to meet with ambassadors of UN Security Council member states, as well as senior officials at the UN missions and the UN Secretariat to seek their support in Seoul's bid to regain a seat as a non-permanent member of the council in 2024. Minister Park will then head to Washington to hold talks with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Friday. The two will likely focus on strengthening the U.S. extended deterrence and joint efforts to tackle North Korea's growing nuclear threat. As the talks will take place just ahead of Blinken's planned trip to China, the two countries' relations with China will also likely be brought to the table. A plan to induce China to play a bigger role in deterring North Korea's provocations could also be discussed. And much attention is also drawn to whether some progress can be made in convincing the U.S. to remove discriminatory elements of the Inflation Reduction Act on South Korean automakers. Minister Park Jin is also scheduled to meet with senior officials at the U.S. National Aeronautics and Space Administration to discuss bilateral cooperation in space-related areas. Park, on his way to board the plane at Incheon Airport today, told reporters that he's also reviewing whether to attend the upcoming Munich Security Conference. And if he does, he may have a chance to meet with Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi, who may also take part in the annual gathering. Although we don't know for sure yet if the two top diplomats will attend the conference, chances are looking very high that they both will. And if they do sit down for talks, it'll come at a time when the two nations are at a critical juncture with regards to resolving the compensation issue for Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor.
Yeah, and again, and the timing of this visit to Washington, right, just before Anthony Blinken is heading over to China for talks there. And I mean, do I think China is going to try to play a bigger role in deterring North Korea's provocation? I mean, they say they do, but, we've never really seen actions on that front when it comes to Beijing. Nevertheless, a lot of things happened in the past 3 years. We, of course, soon enough, it's going to be exactly, I believe, 3 years when the pandemic was officially declared for COVID-19. We had just almost a year ago, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But one thing that sort of got overshadowed with everything that was going on in the world in the past 3 years is the military coup in Myanmar. Now, it's been almost, I believe it's about 2-year anniversary is what we're looking at this time. One of the unfortunate things, because when it first happened, there was a great deal of discussions on this front. We've had experts, we had people inside Myanmar that we interviewed, and unfortunately, in the following year, I mean, there was just little to no coverage on this, unfortunately. We had countries around the world, this including South Korea, United States, and the EU, issuing a joint statement calling for an end to violence and a return to the democratic path on this very 2-year anniversary of a military coup in Myanmar. Chiang, tell us more about this.
Sure. Now, 2 years ago on this day, the Myanmar military staged a coup d'etat and seized power against the will of the people, killing many of their own who resisted the military regime and pushed for a return to democracy, and even to those who conducted peaceful protests. So countries including South Korea, the United States, the EU, and 19 other countries issued a joint statement on Wednesday, February 1st. Now, the statement was signed by the country's foreign ministers and the EU's diplomatic chief, pressuring Myanmar's military regime to end violence and create space for meaningful and inclusive dialogue to allow for any democratic process to resume. Now, it also calls on the military regime to effectively and fully implement ASEAN's 5-point consensus and immediately release all arbitrarily detained prisoners, including President Win Myint and State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, the statement also urged the international community to support efforts to hold those responsible for human rights violations and abuses to account, and also meet the urgent humanitarian needs of Myanmar's people.
Yeah, unfortunately, these statements are more symbolic than anything. And as we've seen, I mean, there's going to be a lot of statements urging them to do this, urging them to do this. We talked about during the UN disarmament talks, urging North Korea to, give up its nuclear weapons program. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. Despite statements like this coming from the international community, the Myanmar military is just not going to give up the power that they took back. And from what I understand, and time to time I have been keeping up with the news going on in Myanmar, there is still ongoing fights going on. There are protests going on. There are people getting arrested just because they are fighting for democracy there. And one of the things that still till this day worries me is we had she was a school teacher who was part of the democratization movement, and she was part of the protest and things like that. And she connected with us. And I remember the connection being really bad because of the situation there. And we connected with her, I believe, twice. And we were unable to reach her the third time around. And so till this day, we have absolutely no idea the whereabouts of that particular teacher that connected with us. And eventually, I mean, hopefully, democracy will be achieved once again in a country that fought so hard for years to achieve that very democracy there. Guys, as always, thank you very much for your reports. Please stay safe, and we'll see you guys again.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang Radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.